Roosevelt III. He's a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's the award-winning author of The Nation That Never Was, a groundbreaking reinterpretation of the American story. Kermit, good to see you again. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have been one of the few people to frame this in a fashion that is really important for us to think about. Donald Trump is kind of hoping that the simple, obvious answer, well, if you're not born here, you shouldn't be a citizen automatically, will wash over most people and be thought of as, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to look at where these arguments are coming from. You know, that's one of the things that you were saying. If you look back before the 14th Amendment, the law is pretty clear, and to the extent that the Trump administration gets any support, they're really kind of misrepresenting what's there. But after the 14th Amendment, there are these people who say what the Trump administration wants to say, that there should be some additional qualification, that not everyone born here deserves to be a citizen. And the key thing to understand, I think, is that those are the former Confederates, right? Those are people who are trying to undo Reconstruction. And they succeeded, you know, very, very substantially. They overthrew the integrated governments. They imposed Jim Crow and segregation. And it's those arguments that those people made against birthright citizenship that we're hearing again now.
That said, this Supreme Court and some Supreme Courts tend to focus on technicalities. And the government's case hinges on the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Talk to me about this. They're saying if the parent is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States or the state in which they live, then the child doesn't qualify under the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, so you can think of this in a technical and complicated way, or you can think of it in the pretty straightforward way that people did at the time, which is it's not about the parents. It doesn't say anything about the parents. It's talking about the children. And if they're born here and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, meaning basically bound by our laws. So there are some exclusions, children of diplomats who have diplomatic immunity and Native Americans who are part of a different sovereignty and not entirely subject to U.S. law, and then children born to invading armies, although that really never happened here. But if you're thinking about either temporary visitors or undocumented immigrants, their children are fully subject to our laws. That's all it requires. You know, people have come up with these complicated theories about amity and allegiance and reciprocal obligations, but actually that's not in the Constitution, and that's not how that phrase was originally understood.
This is also not a matter that has been sort of questioned a lot in mainstream legal thought for a while. It did come up in Project 2025. It is part of a larger fabric of things that Trump and his folks would like to change. But why does this get to the Supreme Court? Why is it even a thing that we're considering at this point?
Well, it gets there because Trump does it. You know, so there are lots of fringe legal theories out there that don't have the power of the U.S. government behind them. And they're not going to make it to the Supreme Court because some crazy person will bring this argument and it'll get dismissed at the district court level and it just won't go up. The Supreme Court won't hear it. But Trump really did force this issue onto their agenda through this executive order where he said, you know, as president, basically, I can undo centuries of progress just with a stroke of my pen.
The court, some of the justices, including some of the conservatives, including the Chief Justice, appeared skeptical of the administration's arguments this week. What were your key takeaways from the oral arguments?
Well, so the good news is I definitely don't think that there are 5 votes to support Trump's position here. I think, you know, a justice who's going to read the Constitution fairly would side against him. A justice who's going to look at the history objectively would side against him. And a justice who's going to consider the institutional status of the Supreme Court and what their legacy would be is going to rule against him, too. So, you know, I think you've got 6, 7, maybe even 8 votes against the administration on this, which should be a relief. You know, but we should also be aware that the administration is pushing legal theories that really would be disastrous for our national identity.
So let's talk about that, because we've spent a lot of time today talking about the 14th Amendment within the context of the Civil War and the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments together. Are there other efforts underway that feel like this? We know in the streets there are efforts going on to sort of roll up people and get them thrown out of the country. But are there other legal efforts at this level that we should be equally concerned about?
Well, I would put in the same category the attack on affirmative action. which is undoing government attempts to promote racial equality. So you're sort of undoing some of the 14th Amendment there. I would put the attacks on voting rights, the way in which the Supreme Court has undermined and basically destroyed the Voting Rights Act. That's attacking the 15th Amendment. And I think if you look at the way that they're trying to get society to work with sort of a school-to-prison pipeline, you can see that there's an attempt to undo some of the 13th Amendment, too.
Kermit, this is a remarkable discussion, and we appreciate the time that you've given us this morning to try and make it clearer. Kermit Roosevelt is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and is the author of The Nation That Never Was, a groundbreaking reinterpretation of the American story. We'll be right back.